When it comes to managing your money and investments, developing, building, and implementing systems like these is one of the most effective ways to grow your wealth. It's money models like these that have given me a clear vision of where my money is supposed to go and can also help you achieve your goals faster, more confidently, and also with less effort and stress. Today, we'll be looking at an optimized personal finance flowchart for US investors, though the general concepts are still applicable for all investors. This flowchart, originally developed in the Our Personal Finance subreddit, is an excellent starter guide for where to allocate your money across different accounts. I will walk through the full guide while marking and adding important considerations as we go along. And if you're new to the channel, consider subscribing for more high-value investment and finance content like this in the future. Now, this flowchart system is split up into 6 main steps, with an initial step 0 for the most basic financial needs. These are outlined up here in these colored boxes. And this is a general overview of the whole process. Now, many of you are probably already at step 6, which is excellent, but this guide can still serve as a good check to make sure you're not missing anything within your own system. And if you're not quite at step 6, well then there's certainly going to be a lot of value to have from this process. So let's start with step 0, which is to create a budget. And right off the bat, I'm going to flag a little warning sign here. And this isn't to say that creating a budget is bad. I think it's great for many people and is a very logical first step. But I think in addition to budgeting, also physically tracking your expenses is also quite important. While budgeting can be good as a plan, tracking is important to make sure you stick to that plan. Whether you use an app or just manually track your expenses, this can make sure you're staying on track when following this process. It'll also help you focus on cutting unnecessary expenses, which is particularly important the earlier you are in this flowchart. Moving through the flowchart, the next steps are to pay essential expenses in these orders. And there's no issue with these. Paying your rent and mortgage, buying food and groceries, paying essential items, paying expenses that are required for earning income, paying healthcare and healthcare insurance, and making sure you make those minimum payments on all debts and loans that you have. Now, once you've done that, you've completed step 0, which again is to budget and reduce expenses and set realistic financial goals. After that, the next step, step 1, is to build that emergency fund, which you've probably already heard. And this I fully agree with, building a small emergency fund. In this case, it's saying $1,000 or 1 month's worth of expenses, whichever is greater. That is correct. It says use a savings or checking account. And the one note I would add to this is preferably use a savings account to at least generate some interest on that small emergency fund. The additional benefit of having in, let's say, your savings account rather than a checking account is that it's physically separate from your checking account or whatever your general spending account is. After that, the flowchart has us pay any non-essential bills in full. And I have actually a little bit of a warning symbol here. Not that this is wrong, but I think in general you want to try and cut or cancel as much unnecessary expenses as you can until you are at that step 6. So from this provided list here, internet and phone are probably necessities, but cable, for instance, is something that I think should definitely be cut. Now, if you're already in a contract and have the bill to pay, then you should pay it, but ideally you want to try and get out of those contracts and any other unnecessary expenses you have. After that, we move into step 2, which is employer matching funds, typically for retirement contributions. Here you need to ask yourself, does your employer offer a retirement account with an employer match? Most commonly in the US, this is your 401k. And generally speaking, most employers that do offer a 401k offer some kind of matching program. Whether that's dollar for dollar, as in you put in 3% and they match 3%, or sometimes it's a little uneven where you put in 6 and they match 3. If you're not sure, take a bit of time to figure that out. If your employer does offer a match, make sure you're contributing the amount needed to get that full match, but nothing above that amount just yet. We'll get back to how much more you should be adding later in the future steps. The next section is section 3, which is these green boxes, which is paying down high and moderate interest debts. Here you have to ask yourself another question, which is, do you have any high interest debt? In this case, we're saying high interest is with an interest rate of 10% or more. If the answer is yes, the flowchart is suggesting evaluate the merits of the avalanche and snowball methods and their advantage in your personal financial psychology situation and apply accordingly to pay off these debts. Now, I have a warning symbol here because this is probably the biggest issue I have potentially with this flowchart. And to get to that, we'll have to define what these avalanche and snowball methods are. So the debt avalanche is effectively prioritizing interest rates when you pay down your debts. So in this case, you'd pay off debt with the highest interest rate first, and then after that one's completely paid off, move on to the next highest interest rate after that. Although it's important to understand that you still need to make the minimum debt payments on all your debts regardless. Using this strategy will allow you to pay less interest over time. The debt snowball, on the other hand, prioritizes balances. So you pay off the smallest dollar amount of debt first and then move on to the bigger ones next. While this does build psychological motivation by finishing a debt faster, it doesn't really make sense from a financial standpoint because you're allowing interest to accrue on some of your higher interest debts when you're really focusing on paying off just the smaller ones. So if you're going through the effort of actually improving your financial situation and paying off your debt, do yourself the favor of paying off your high interest debt first, as those savings will help compound for you in the future. And as a caveat note, if needed, focus on fixing the spending habits that got you in debt in the first place, and don't accrue any of this high interest debt going forward again. Once you have all of your high interest debt fully paid off, you can then go back on step 1 and fully complete that emergency fund. In this case, building that emergency fund to 3 to 6 months of living expenses, which you can use a savings or checking account. Again, as I've discussed before, we'll want to have that in a savings account or a money market fund in a brokerage account so that you at least can earn some interest on that emergency fund. And that way it'll also be separate from your main checking account. And the reason you want to pay off your high interest debt first is because it doesn't really make sense to hold cash that's maybe yielding 5% if you have debt outstanding that's yielding 10% or more. You're basically just paying extra interest when you should be using that cash to pay off the high interest debt first. And then once that's gone, then you can put back into the emergency fund at 5% or whatever short-term interest rates are at the time you're watching this. The next question you want to have, which is going back again to paying off debts, is do you have any moderate interest debt? And so in this case, I think when this flowchart was made in the mid-2010s, interest rates were much lower. So in this case, it's saying 4 to 5% of an interest rate for moderate interest rate debt. Nowadays, at least in the mid-2020s, people would be very happy to have debt at 4 or 5% compared to maybe 7 or 8% where many rates are today for debts and loans, at least on the mortgage side. So if you do have any other debts, again, we'll run into the avalanche versus snowball method. But here, it's important to take into consideration the actual interest rate of these debt obligations compared to potential alternatives that you have. What I mean by this is, let's say you have a debt or mortgage, for instance, of let's say 4%. If you can earn 5%, say, in a money market fund or high yield savings account, it makes it less of a financial necessity to pay off that debt immediately, because if the interest rate on that debt is similar to or less than that which you could receive from a high yield savings account or a money market mutual fund, i.e. low risk investments, then you could potentially keep some of the amount that you would be using to pay off that debt in the high yield savings account and just earn more interest than the debt interest is charging you over time. Again, this is a little more of a nuanced situation, but it's just important to keep your options open in case you are in the unique situation where you have potential for interest rate arbitrage between lower interest debt and potentially higher yielding low risk investments. But assuming that's not the case, you can simply focus on knocking out any of that moderate interest debt because it's a great feeling to be debt free anyway, and there is some argument to be made for the psychological benefit of that. In that case, assuming you paid off your non-mortgage debts, you can move on to step 4, which is saving for retirement in a traditional or Roth IRA. In this case, I won't get into the specifics of Roth versus traditional here, but one thing to keep in mind is that if you're able to contribute to these accounts and are within the income limits, it generally makes sense to do so. Whether or not you benefit more from a Roth or traditional depends primarily on what your marginal tax rate is today and what you expect your tax rate to be in the future when you're pulling money out of these accounts. If you're in a high tax bracket today, a traditional IRA probably makes a fair amount of sense. However, if you're in a low tax bracket, contributing to the Roth probably will do better for you over the long term. Next, the flowchart is asking if you're expecting any large required purchases or personal investments in the near future. So in this case, it's saying college, professional certifications, a car so you can get to work, etc. And I actually really like the position this is in the flowchart because investments you make in yourself and your skills and your earnings ability can be some of the best investments that you make. So you do still need to make sure you're getting a significant enough expected return from those investments. So if you were thinking of going to college to major in underwater basket weaving, I highly suggest you reconsider the financial ramifications of that. On the other hand, if you're going to trade school, you'll probably get a very high ROI on that investment. Once you've done step 4, investing in your IRA retirement account and investing in yourself, whether it's education or certification or whatever skills you need to invest in, the next step, step 5, is to save more for retirement. And retirement may seem far away, but just think of this as building your wealth and building your nest egg for the future. So in this case, the next question is, are you saving at least 15% of your pre-tax income for retirement? This is total contributions to all retirement accounts, and I'll also say all taxable accounts if you're making those outside of retirement accounts as well. And keep in mind, if maybe you're older and closer to retirement age and you're planning and hoping to retire, you may have to save more if you're behind on retirement savings. If you're not saving at least 15% and your employer does have some kind of retirement account, whether it's a 401k or 403b or something along that line, then you want to increase your contributions until you get back to that 15% pre-tax income being saved for retirement. Now, if you don't have a 401k through your employer or you're self-employed, for example, there are other tax-advantaged retirement accounts you can use, like the individual 401k, the SEP IRA or simple IRA, but it's perfectly fine as well to just simply use a normal individual taxable brokerage account to meet this requirement. The main thing is you want to be saving at least 15%. And this is sort of an arbitrary number, but the bigger, the better. And we'll get into it a bit later in step 6, where you can actually save much more. But as a baseline, I think this is a fair rule. And so scrolling down a bit, as you can see, the purple box is step 6. So if you are saving at least 15%, you can move on to the final stage. Congrats. So here our question is, do you have a high deductible health plan and thus are eligible for an investable HSA? If you do, then the next suggestion is to maximize that HSA contribution, which I think is generally a good idea. Some HSA plans are better than others, and some of the best plans have low or no fees and allow you to actually invest those contributions. And the benefit of the HSA is that if you use the money for qualified health expenses, then your contributions end up being tax-free and your distributions for qualified medical expenses are tax-free as well. So if you have a qualified high deductible health plan, it can be a very useful account to have. And even in the future, you don't have a high deductible health plan, you still keep all the assets within the HSA. You just can't make any new contributions until you're back on a high deductible health plan. The next question in step 6 is asking, do you have children you wish to help pay for some or all of their college expenses? And if the answer is yes, it suggests evaluate available savings and investment options such as a 529 plan and contribute accordingly. But the main reason I have a little warning symbol here is that it's important to understand the potential impact that 529 plans and the amount you contribute to those could have for financial aid. Having 529 plan assets in the name of the student can have a significant impact on the financial aid process. Now, the rules may have changed and are likely still changing, so this may or may not be the case in the future. But if financial aid and qualifying for financial aid is important to you, then you'll want to do your research and plan accordingly. But once you've done that, at this point you have options in terms of what you want to do next and how to proceed, and it's really completely up to you and your personal goals and desires. Put another way, if you've completed this flowchart and are following this system, you are going to systematically build wealth over time. Though if you do have some other goals, there are some things you can consider. For instance, if you're interested in potentially retiring early, and this doesn't necessarily have to be early retirement, it could just be financial independence. There are some other accounts and contributions you can continue to make that should be considered. So I have both sort of a warning sign and check sign here because this is generally all fine, but there are a few caveats. So when it comes to fully maxing out the rest of your 401k space, taken into consideration, just like we did with the IRA, of the tax impact of Roth versus traditional 401k contributions if your employer offers both post-tax Roth accounts or pre-tax traditional accounts. Again, as we mentioned, that's going to depend on what your current marginal tax rate is and your expected tax rate in the future. But generally speaking, if you're at a high tax rate now, it may make sense to go with traditional versus if you're at a lower tax rate, relatively speaking to your future projections, then a Roth may make sense. You may have heard of a mega backdoor Roth IRA. That's something that existed in the past. Future legislation is likely going to change that going forward, so that may or may not be an option. But even if it's not the end of the world, because I think in general, a taxable account is one of the best accounts in terms of just flexibility and liquidity that you can add to after, say, maxing out your 401k. Instead of having restrictions on when you can access the money with these retirement accounts, you just contribute to an individual or taxable brokerage account. Yes, you do still pay taxes on capital gains and dividends, but if you invest for the long term and in a tax efficient way, then the tax impact is significantly mitigated and can still be managed over time. The other question is, do you have more immediate goals? And in this case, it suggests using savings for goals sooner than 3 or 5 years, and then using a conservative mix of stock or bonds for goals more than 3 or 5 years away. And this I give also a check and a warning, but overall this is generally good. The caveat here, which may be obvious but isn't directly stated, is that you need to save or invest in taxable accounts or savings accounts for this, not retirement accounts. Unless, of course, you are of the age where you can access the money from your retirement accounts. But for those who are not and don't want to take the penalty for early withdrawals, having this in taxable will be important. And then the investment allocation really depends on the time horizon, and I think the general idea of this is correct. If you have a goal that's soon, you probably don't want to risk in investing in assets that can have potential for short-term fluctuations, even if maybe there is some opportunity cost you're giving up there. For goals that are a bit longer away, like the 3 to 5 year suggestion it has here, using a mix of assets that can provide a bit more expected appreciation than, let's say, cash, might help you achieve those goals faster. I think this is totally fine as long as you have the flexibility or adaptability that if markets maybe move differently than you expected, maybe in a negative way, then you have the ability to adjust your plans to reflect the new circumstances. Maybe most likely by just delaying the purchase until markets recover. Ultimately, that choice is up to you, but we may have a few future videos discussing that in more specifics. So assuming you invest reasonably, if you follow this system, you will gain and grow your wealth over time. It's just mathematically impossible not to do so. And that's why I love flowcharts and processes like this, especially in the context of investing, because it really allows you to systematize the wealth building game.